Aphrodite and Eros. Aphrodite, called Venus by the Romans, is also called Cytherea in Cyprus, which we saw in Hesiod, because she was associated with both of those islands when she was born, near Cythera and near Cyprus. As we've seen, Aphrodite has different accounts of her birth. One, she's born from Uranus alone, born of the sexual violence that we saw. And philosophers have called this Aphrodite Urania, the celestial Aphrodite, sprung from Uranus alone, sprung from the heaven alone, and therefore connected with the heavenly kind of love, ethereal and sublime. It has more to do with the love of the gods, or the divine love that exists from God to human, and a greater love that humans can exhibit that does not have a sexual connotation or a physical component. And then there's Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of all the people, Pandemos, like a pandemic, it hits all the people, sprung from Zeus and Dione. And this one is physical in nature, and so this is the sexual procreative love that we very much associate with Aphrodite and what most of the stories celebrate. She's the goddess of beauty and love and even marriage, the love that exists between man and wife. And she's called laughter-loving and sweetly smiling. We have the gray-eyed goddess and the cow-eyed goddess, and we have sweetly smiling or laughter-loving Aphrodite. It's possible that there is some temple prostitution associated with her. She's certainly the patron goddess of prostitutes, but in some cases there might actually be some sort of temple prostitution, which typically means that the prostitutes who are serving the temple are actually serving on behalf of the goddess, and people will worship by having sexual relations with the prostitute, and then the payment will be kind of like the tithe. You're making a devotional offering to the goddess. Aphrodite has a magic girdle that has irresistible powers of enticement. So if we associate a spear and a shield and a helmet with Athena, Aphrodite has her girdle, and when she's using the girdle, or when she loans it out to someone, whoever's using the girdle cannot be resisted. We can see a lot of the development of the Greek artistic styles by looking at representations of Aphrodite. In the archaic and early classical periods, 800-400 BC roughly, she is portrayed always as a beautiful woman, of course, but typically she is clothed. When we get into the late classical through the Hellenistic and Roman periods, say from 400 BC on, she becomes the idealization of womanhood, and she's usually nude. So if we think about the famous portraits or the famous statues of Venus or Aphrodite, whichever it is, Roman or Greek, the nudity is involved, and she becomes this icon of perfect feminine sexuality. Unlike Athena, Aphrodite has attendants. She often has women who are helping her along with her day or her schemes or whatever it is she's doing. Mostly the graces, the charites, we associate with her, and there are 3 in number. They're personifications of different aspects of loveliness. There are also the hours, which are sometimes hard to distinguish between the graces because it's still 3. You just see 3 females associated with her. And these are children of Zeus and Themis, and eventually they turn into the seasons. As with Athena, there are a number of stories associated with Aphrodite, and we'll talk about a few of the most important ones during the lecture today. One is Pygmalion. Now, of course, this is a Roman story from Ovid, so they use the name Venus. Again, don't be misled by that. Venus and Aphrodite are the same. The women of Cyprus then denied Venus's deity. They didn't believe she was a god, and so to get even with them, she turned them into prostitutes. Being prostitutes, they lost all emotion and eventually then turned into stone. We'll see here that a lot of gods will punish you in terrible ways, and we'll see a lot of punishments for humans during this course. But Aphrodite may have some of the worst ways, because she will destroy your life, your reputation, your everything. We'll see this on a number of occasions. The sculptor Pygmalion was disgusted, repelled by all the women that he knew because of this, And he decided to sculpt the ideal woman for himself. And so, being an artist, being a sculptor, he did. He made her out of ivory, and she was the ideal form of femininity. She was everything that every man could possibly imagine as desirable in a woman. And then, of course, he fell in love with the sculpture. No real woman could match what he had created in his own workshop. And so he began to put clothes on her and dress her and care for her and lay her on the couch and lay her on the bed and began to enjoy her favors, I guess you could say. And then he became so consumed with her, so obsessed with her, that he prayed to Venus for her to become real. And so then, when he had returned from the festival and began to lay his hands on her and to feel her body, he felt the warmth flow into her, and he knew that she was turning real, and she responded to his caress, to his touch, and she became a real woman. She became Galatea. The story of Pygmalion and Galatea has become iconic culturally. We see it replayed over and over, which is one of the things about classical mythology, is that thematically they touch somehow the human yearning, the human spirit, our fears, our beliefs, our hopes, our desires, our dreams, our loves, and these themes continue to be interesting to us, even portrayed in different ways. Some of the most recent ways, My Fair Lady, you may have seen, or Pretty Woman, basically any story where you have one person who takes another person and makes a new creation out of them and then falls in love with them. This is the portrayal of the story. Aphrodite's stories often have a much darker side than the other gods and goddesses. For instance, the story of Cinyras. This story, grandchild of Pygmalion, turns out that he is loved by his daughter. His daughter Mira she develops a sexual obsession for him, and using her maid, actually formulate a plan to seduce him and cover up darkness under drunkenness, and it turns into an affair through the night. The father has no idea this is going on. He doesn't know who the woman he's sleeping with is. When he eventually finds out, he's horrified, and he wants to kill her, but she leaves, and she wanders around then, pregnant with his child, in misery, in despair, in depression, until eventually she stops wandering and she's transformed into the mirror tree. And it's from this tree that Adonis is born. Venus fell in love with Adonis, and the stories that Ovid gives us are quite nice, where they're just laying in a nice glen, making love, and enjoying each other's company and telling stories. But there's always a tragic ending. Human interaction with the divine rarely ends happily, and with Venus, there's always an even deeper tragedy associated with it, because it involves love. It involves our deepest emotions. And in this story, then, she tells Adonis to avoid hunting, and he doesn't, and then, of course, he gets killed hunting, because anytime a goddess says avoid something and you do it, then, well, you're going to pay the penalty. But then she has pity on him, and she helps him transform into the anemone. One of the more important stories about Aphrodite is her relationship with Anchises, the Trojan prince. This involves the revenge of Zeus. Aphrodite had plagued most of the gods with her powers of love and seduction, and sent them on to humiliate them by making them fall in love with one being, one creature or another, and then she liked to laugh at them. Zeus thought he would get revenge one day, so he fomented her passions for a mortal, the mortal Anchises, and you read the nice story in it there in the hymn to Aphrodite. And she adorns herself with all the charms and graces that she has, and she seduces the young man, and they enjoy their night together, and then of course she's left pregnant with the hero Aeneas. But she tells him before she leaves that you can't tell anybody about this. Now, probably the kind of thing you need to say beforehand, but she waits until afterwards. Says, I'm actually the goddess Aphrodite, and we've had a nice time together, but you cannot tell anyone about this, and I will give you the child. How's Anchises going to keep this a secret, though? Because honestly, you have to tell somebody. You were just with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and word does get out, and of course he has to pay the penalty also. Zeus hits him with a lightning bolt, which possibly blinds him. In some stories it kills him. In any event, he does have to pay the penalty. And being a goddess of love, we shouldn't be surprised that she has a number of children by different fathers. One of the most popular is Priapus. He's a son of Aphrodite, and he is, well, you can see the picture there. He's known because he has this deformity, this massive erect phallus. It's just massive, and you can see it there. The Romans, the Greeks, they thought this was hilarious, and they loved to put it in pictures and all sorts of things like that. We actually have a disease, or a condition, let's say a medical condition, called priapism, named for this, and that's the inability to lose an erection. If you watch Viagra commercials, they'll often say priapism. You might be experiencing priapism if the erection won't end after a certain amount of time. Anyway, named for him. And he's one of the gods that's not quite taken seriously. He's comic, and he's pornographic, and people think it's funny. There's actually an entire corpus of poetry dedicated to him called the Priapeia, and it's all just really dirty and filthy and sometimes hilarious poetry. It's lots of penis jokes. The penis jokes are universal, so, you know, Greeks and Romans thought they were hilarious too, I guess. Funny, though, is that he's associated with popular charms, good luck charms, apotropaic devices, that is, things to ward off evil, and whereas we have keep off the grass signs, they would have sometimes wind chimes or something associated to Priapus, some sort of a curse associated with Priapus. So it says basically if somebody steps on the grass, if somebody violates this garden, then Priapus will violate you. And another child of Aphrodite is Eros, also Cupid to the Romans. There are two origin stories. We already saw the one from Hesiod, where he's this cosmic deity, this really primal force of love that is creative, that brings about massive change and creation. There's also a story that he's a child of Ares and Aphrodite, and we see him represented in different ways, sometimes as a mischievous child. So if you ever see a picture of the Cupid, the child with the diaper and the bow and arrow, well, that's him, and in some ancient stories he is portrayed that way, going around shooting people with arrows just for fun, to watch them fall in love and fall into misadventures. The other, he's a beautiful young man, and this is more angelic in his features, and you can see this is the representation of him in the picture here. One of our fullest discussions of love itself from antiquity comes from Plato in the work The Symposium. Now, this is where we get the concept of platonic love from, if you've ever used that term. The idea is that Eros itself is this creative force that brings about change. But in the pure form, in the platonic form of love, the physical nature of love itself is something that just leads into the higher spiritual nature of it. So we're adorned with grace and charm, or the love that we feel when we're attracted to someone is really just an opening stage of a deeper discussion and understanding of love itself. Our love of the form and the outward beauty leads to a love of the inward beauty and the goodness. Ultimately, love of good on the outside leads to love of good on the inside. And when you have become a lover of the good of the person on the inside, then you become a lover of good itself. And so the earthly form of love, of attraction, of sexuality, of procreation, leads to an appreciation of the good, of virtue, of goodness itself, which leads you to a higher understanding of goodness, and then a love of God, ultimately, a philosophic love of wisdom and good and truth and God. This is the end of this lecture. Next, we will take up the topic of Artemis.